This next passage comes out of Mark chapter 15, starting verse 33. It says, "At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' When some of those standing near heard this, they said, 'Listen, he's calling Elijah.'" This idea of Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I've taught a number of lessons on this, and every time I read it, I look at it from a different angle, I feel like. I want to clean it up sometimes and say, oh, he's actually teaching in this moment, and he's reminding the Jews around him to go look at Psalm 22, which is the beginning of the psalm he's quoting, which then describes the scenes going on around him of them dividing his clothes and casting lots. And in the end, it talks about God's salvation. And so I've taught about how Jesus is teaching in this moment. But right now, with all the suffering going on in the world, I'm really drawn to the reality that in suffering, it feels like God isn't there. And all throughout the Psalms, 40% of the Psalms are lament, and all throughout the Psalms, this is what they're crying out. They're saying, "God, where are you? Where are you in this?" And if I sit with this for too long, I start thinking about, okay, well, which is worse? I don't actually think God is actually turning his back on Jesus. I don't think that's who God is. I remember hearing lessons that God couldn't be with Jesus because of sin, and he just took on the sins of the world, and so he abandoned Jesus in that moment. I'm not sure I see that, because God desires to be with me. He places his Spirit. He is with me through the Spirit, in me, in the Spirit, and I'm sinful. And so I don't see God turning his back on Jesus. But if I'm struggle with this too much, I ask hard questions like, which is worse, for God to turn his back on Jesus, or for God to stand there and do nothing? And these are hard questions to wrestle with, and they're honest questions to wrestle with when you're suffering. God, where are you? And we see the humanity of Jesus on full display right here, where he, in his suffering, feels abandoned by God. And if you've ever suffered greatly, it feels like God is distant. But also during those times, sometimes God feels the closest, because you're stripped of all resolve, and you're stripped of all ability to provide for yourself, and the only one who can provide for you is God. And so most of those Psalms end with, "But God, you are faithful." And it's in this moment where Jesus is saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He also knows that God will show up. God will act. Even though it's in God's time, it's never in our timing, but God will show up and act. And so I want to challenge you to wrestle with this. What does it mean for God to not show up when we want him to? And what does it mean to relinquish control of when God acts and just be faithful that God will act? Where are some places in your life that you need to actually cry out to God the way that Jesus has? and to recognize that that's not faithlessness, but it's actually a faithful response to suffering. And it's an honest response to suffering. I'm going to ask a harder theological question. We're more comfortable with Jesus being God, that, he does everything he does because he's God. But in this moment, Jesus is feeling real pain physically, but even more so, real pain spiritually. He's experiencing darkness of God's absence. What does it mean for your relationship with God that Jesus was allowed to suffer? And the writer of Hebrews even talks about he learned perfection through what he suffered. But what does it mean that Jesus in his humanity suffered fully? And what does that mean for when you're going through suffering, that you have a high priest who understands? My God, why have you forsaken me?